I was standing in a hospital conference room when the attorney slid the document across the table. Not to me. To my sister, Alara. The paper made a soft whisper against the polished wood, and I watched her fingers curl around its edges like she'd been expecting it. This reflects your father's final wishes, the attorney said, his voice clinical and rehearsed. My sister's hands trembled slightly, but her face stayed carefully neutral. Dad was sedated down the hall, barely conscious, prepped for surgery that could go either way. I felt heat rushing to my face as the words registered. Updated will. Effective immediately. My name wasn't on the page the attorney had shown her. I realized in that moment that I was being erased in real time. This wasn't a family decision. This was an ambush. My throat tightened as I tried to process what was happening. How had we gotten here? 24 hours ago, I was still Dad's primary caregiver, the one managing everything. Now I was standing in this sterile room, watching my inheritance vanish into my sister's shaking hands. Alara finally looked at me, and her voice came out too rehearsed. He changed it yesterday. Dad wanted this. Yesterday. The word hung in the air like smoke. Yesterday, Dad couldn't even hold a cup of water without help. His hands shook too badly. The pain medication kept him drifting in and out of awareness, his words slurring together until they made no sense. I remembered watching the nurses adjust his drip. Remembered how he'd looked at me without recognition for almost 30 seconds before his eyes cleared. And somehow, in that condition, he'd completely rewritten his estate plan. My chest tightened as anger and confusion twisted together. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at my sister and asked one simple question. What time? She blinked, caught off guard by how calm I sounded. What? What time did he sign it? I repeated. The attorney shifted in his seat. Alara's mouth opened, then closed. Afternoon, I think. Around 3. I nodded slowly, committing that answer to memory. Because I remembered exactly where I'd been at 3 o'clock yesterday. My name is Sarah Cross, and until that moment in the conference room, I had been my father's primary caregiver for 8 months. Not part-time. Not when it was convenient. Every single day. I managed his medications, tracked his appointments, decoded insurance paperwork that seemed designed to confuse people. I sat through doctor consultations taking notes while everyone else was too busy. I was there for the 2 a.m. emergency room visits when his pain spiked. I rearranged my entire life around his diagnosis. My sister, Alara, drifted in occasionally when relatives were visiting or when she needed something. She'd show up with flowers and tears, playing the devoted daughter for an audience, then disappear again for weeks. The family ate up her performance every time. Poor Alara, so emotional, so caring. Meanwhile, I was the practical one, the reliable one, the one nobody worried about because I always handled everything. I'd stopped trying to correct the narrative months ago. It was exhausting and nobody wanted to hear it anyway. But now, standing in that conference room, I was being told I was never part of the plan. I left the conference room and walked straight to the nurse's station on Dad's floor. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my expression neutral. I found Brenda, the nurse who'd been on shift that morning. She was updating charts, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Hey, I said casually, like my world hadn't just collapsed. Quick question about yesterday. What time was Dad's last sedation dose? Brenda looked up, and I saw something flicker across her face. A hesitation. Just a beat too long before she answered. Let me check the chart. She pulled up his file on the computer, scrolling slowly. Too slowly. He was in and out most of the afternoon. We adjusted the dosage around 2:30. I nodded, keeping my voice light. In and out. So he was conscious sometimes. Briefly, she said carefully, but not really alert. More like present but confused. I thanked her and walked away before she could see my hands shaking. In and out. Confused. That didn't sound like someone capable of making major legal decisions. That sounded like someone who shouldn't have been signing anything more complicated than a get-well card. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and pulled out my phone. The attorney's business card was still in my pocket from the conference room. Aaron Finley, attorney at law. I typed his name into the search bar and started reading. His website was professional but generic. Standard legal language about estate planning and family law. But when I scrolled to the reviews, a pattern emerged. Client after client mentioned expedited estate revisions and quick turnarounds during medical emergencies. One review praised him for making difficult decisions easier when time was critical. Another mentioned how he understood the urgency of hospital situations. Every single 5-star review used similar language. Fast, efficient, understanding of time constraints. These weren't people planning their estates years in advance. These were crisis situations. Deathbed changes. I kept scrolling until I found what I was looking for. A 1-star review from someone whose family member had signed documents while heavily medicated. The review had been removed, but Google's cache still showed it. I screenshot everything. Then I started looking for who had contacted Aaron Finley in the first place. Hospital policy required that Dad's personal phone be kept in the secure drawer at the nurse's station. I'd signed the log dozens of times to retrieve it for him. Now I asked to see the access log from the past week. The nurse on duty hesitated, but I'd been there so often, been so involved in Dad's care, that she pulled it up without much resistance. My name appeared multiple times. Expected. But so did Alaris. 3 times in one evening. The night before the will was changed. I felt my pulse quicken. Dad's arthritis had gotten so bad that he couldn't manage the touchscreen anymore. His fingers wouldn't cooperate. I'd watched him struggle with it for weeks before finally setting up voice commands for essential contacts. Alara knew this. Everyone knew this. Yet according to the log, she'd accessed his phone 3 separate times between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. I pulled out my own phone and called Dad's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Then I checked his recent call history through the family phone plan account I managed. 3 outgoing calls that night. All within minutes of each other. One number stood out immediately. The number belonged to Aaron Finley's office. I stared at the call log, my mind racing backward through the past few months. Every family gathering. Every hospital visit. Every time Alara showed up with red eyes and a trembling voice, talking about how hard this all was. How she wished she could do more but work was so demanding. How grateful she was that I was strong enough to handle everything. The relatives would rush to comfort her. Poor Alara, so sensitive. So devoted. Meanwhile, I was the one sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair, waking up every time a nurse came in to check vitals. I was the one who knew which medications couldn't be taken together, which foods Dad could still tolerate, which doctor to call for specific symptoms. But I never cried in front of anyone. I never complained. So I became invisible. The dependable daughter who didn't need support or recognition. I thought about all those times I'd corrected the family narrative. Actually, Alara wasn't here last week. No, I'm the one who scheduled that appointment. Each correction made me sound petty, defensive. So eventually I just stopped. I let the lies breathe. I let everyone believe Alara's performance. And now I was paying the price. I finally opened the full copy of the revised will that the attorney had reluctantly provided after I insisted. My hands were steady now, my initial shock crystallizing into something sharper. Focus. The document was dated yesterday. Timestamp 3:15 p.m. signed by Dad. Witnessed by 2 people. That's when I stopped reading and stared at the names. Patricia Holbrook and James Chun. I didn't recognize either name. Not from Dad's social circle. Not from the hospital staff I'd gotten to know over months of daily visits. Not from our extended family. These weren't people who'd been in Dad's life. The witnesses were required to verify that the person signing was of sound mind and acting of their own free will. But how could strangers verify that? I pulled out my laptop and started searching. Patricia Holbrook had a sparse social media presence. Few photos, mostly private. But one public photo from 6 years ago showed her at a restaurant, arm around someone I recognized immediately. My sister. The caption read, "Birthday celebration with my favorite person." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't rushed. This wasn't a last-minute decision made in panic. This had been planned. I remembered Patricia now. 3 years ago, Alara had asked me to loan her money. Not a small amount. $1,500. She'd said it was for a friend going through a rough patch. Patricia something. I'd written the check, never expecting to see that money again. Alara had said they weren't even that close anymore. That Patricia had moved away and they'd lost touch. But here was Patricia's signature on Dad's will, swearing he was mentally competent when I knew for a fact he wasn't. I looked up James Chin next. His digital footprint was even smaller, but I found him eventually. A LinkedIn profile listed him as independent contractor. His connections included Aaron Finley and Patricia Holbrook. I sat back in my car, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. These weren't random witnesses pulled from the hospital hallway. They were people my sister knew. People who could be convinced to sign something without asking too many questions. Maybe people who owed her favors. The attorney specialized in rushed estate changes. The witnesses were connected to Alara. The phone calls were made from Dad's phone while he was barely conscious. Every detail had been carefully arranged. And I'd been completely blindsided. Dad woke up 18 hours after surgery, groggy but stable. I was in his room when his eyes opened, adjusting to the fluorescent lights. He looked confused, his gaze wandering around the room like he was trying to remember where he was. Sarah. His voice was rough from the breathing tube. I'm here, Dad. I squeezed his hand gently. He blinked slowly, processing. Why is everyone fighting? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? Alara was here earlier. She was crying. Kept saying something about how everything was going to be okay now. He paused, his forehead creasing. What's going to be okay? I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him in his current state. But I needed to know. Dad, do you remember signing any papers yesterday? Before surgery. His face went completely blank. The confusion in his eyes deepened into something else. Concern. Maybe fear. Papers. Legal documents. About your will. His hand tightened slightly around mine. What will? The words came out hoarse and uncertain. Sarah, I haven't signed anything. I couldn't even hold a pen yesterday. My hands were shaking too badly. What's going on? I didn't confront Alara. I didn't storm into her house demanding answers. I didn't call the family members who believed her narrative all these months. Instead, I started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet with timestamps. When Dad was sedated. When the will was allegedly signed. When Alara accessed his phone. When the attorney was called. I saved screenshots of everything. Call logs. The access log from the nurse's station. Aaron Finley's reviews. Patricia Holbrook's old social media post. I kept my expression neutral at the hospital. When Alara showed up the next day with magazines and concerned eyes, I smiled at her. How are you holding up? She asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I'm fine, I said calmly. Just glad Dad made it through surgery. She relaxed slightly, probably thinking I'd accepted the situation. That I was going to be the reliable, practical daughter who didn't cause problems. But I noticed her checking her phone constantly. Scrolling nervously. Looking at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Something was making her anxious. Maybe the attorney had warned her that these situations could be challenged. Maybe she was waiting for me to explode. Instead, I just kept smiling. Kept documenting. Kept waiting. I returned to the hospital administration office 3 days later. I'd helped Dad with enough paperwork over the months that several staff members knew me by name. I approached the desk with the same calm demeanor I'd maintained since the conference room. Hi, Angela. I have a question about medical records timeline. For Dad's chart. Angela looked up from her computer. Sure, honey. What do you need? I'm trying to verify the sedation timeline from last Tuesday. Before surgery. Just want to make sure everything's documented correctly for the insurance. It was a reasonable request. Insurance companies were notorious for denying claims over paperwork discrepancies. Angela pulled up the file, scrolling through digital records. She frowned slightly. That's odd. What is? The sedation start time was initially logged at 1:45 p.m., but there's an amendment note changing it to 3:30 p.m. She squinted at the screen. Amendment was made the same day. That's unusual. My heart rate picked up, but I kept my voice steady. Why would it be changed? Could be a data entry error, she said slowly. But typically, sedation times are pretty carefully tracked. Especially pre-surgery. She looked at me with sympathetic concern. If sedation actually started earlier, that would affect the window for any legal capacity assessments. Word spread fast in our family. My aunt called first. Sarah, I heard you're upset about your father's estate planning. Her tone carried judgment wrapped in fake concern. I'm not upset, I said calmly. I'm just making sure everything was done properly. You're causing unnecessary stress while your father is recovering. This is exactly why he probably made changes. You're always so focused on details and control. The accusation stung, but I didn't defend myself. Let her think what she wanted. My uncle called next. Your sister is devastated. She's just trying to respect your father's wishes, and you're making her feel guilty. I haven't said anything to Alara, I replied, which was true. I hadn't confronted her at all. By the end of the week, I was the villain in the family narrative. Greedy, cold, ungrateful, causing problems when I should be grateful Dad survived surgery. Alara was the victim, bravely carrying out Dad's wishes while her difficult sister made everything harder. I listened to the accusations, the disappointment, the lectures about family loyalty. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just let them talk. Because I'd learned something important over the past few months. The people who talk the loudest rarely know what's actually happening. I sent one letter. Professional. Unemotional. Factual. Addressed to Aaron Finley, attorney at law. Dear Mr. Finley, I am writing to request formal verification of my father's mental capacity at the time of signing the revised estate documents dated last Tuesday at 3:15 p.m. Medical records indicate sedation protocols were in effect during this time frame. Please provide documentation confirming proper capacity assessment procedures were followed, including verification that sedation had fully cleared his system, confirmation of witness independence and lack of conflict of interest, medical professional sign-off on decision-making ability. I would appreciate a response within 7 business days. Respectfully, Sarah Cross. I sent it certified mail and kept a copy for my records. His response arrived within 3 hours. Not 7 days. 3 hours. The email was long, aggressive, and overly defensive. He cited legal precedent. He emphasized that my father had been alert and oriented during signing. He mentioned that questioning a will based on personal grievances could have legal consequences for me. He threatened complications if I continued making false claims about his professional conduct. I read the email twice, then saved it. Because innocent people don't threaten first. Confident attorneys don't respond with aggression to reasonable questions. His defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. The response wasn't just defensive. It was panicked. Aaron Finley had copied Alara on the email, which told me they'd already been in contact about my letter. His language was careful but aggressive. He'd used phrases like fully documented procedure and witnessed by qualified parties, and standard protocols followed. But he hadn't actually answered my questions. He hadn't provided medical professional sign-off. He hadn't explained how witnesses verified capacity. He just insisted everything was proper, and warned me against pursuing the matter further. I forwarded the email to a friend from college who'd become an estate attorney. We weren't close anymore, but we'd stayed connected enough that I felt comfortable asking for advice. Her response came the next morning. Sarah, this is extremely defensive language for a simple verification request. In my experience, attorneys who follow proper procedures have no problem providing documentation. The fact that he's threatening you instead of answering suggests he knows there are problems with the process. Be careful, but keep pushing if you believe something's wrong. The law is on your side if capacity was truly compromised. I thanked her and added her email to my growing file of documentation. Alara cornered me in the hospital parking lot 4 days later. I was walking to my car after visiting Dad when I heard her voice behind me. Sarah, wait. I turned. She looked exhausted, her makeup not quite covering the dark circles under her eyes. We need to talk. Okay, I said calmly. She glanced around like she was worried someone might hear us, then lowered her voice to an urgent whisper. You're going to ruin everything. Why can't you just accept this? Accept what exactly? I asked. Her frustration bubbled over. Dad made his choice. You're making everyone miserable by questioning it. The attorney says you're threatening legal action. This is so typical of you. Always needing to control everything. Always needing to be right. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at her, waiting. The silence seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have. He didn't fully understand, she finally admitted, her voice cracking. Okay. He was confused. But it's what he would have wanted. If he'd been thinking clearly, this is what he would have chosen. There it was. The confession buried in defensive justification. Hypothetical wishes don't hold up in court, I said quietly. Her face went pale. You wouldn't. I already have. I walked away. Dad's condition continued improving over the next week. The confusion from anesthesia lifted. His mind cleared. He started asking more questions, noticing the tension whenever Alara and I were in the same room. One afternoon, I brought him a copy of the revised will. He'd asked for it directly, his tone leaving no room for debate. I watched him read through it slowly, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. His hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness. From anger. His face reddened as he turned each page. This isn't what I wanted, he said finally, his voice tight. Dad. This isn't what I said at all. I told Alara I wanted to make sure she'd be okay, that's all. I never said anything about changing everything. I never said anything about excluding you. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. When did I supposedly sign this? Last Tuesday. The afternoon before surgery. His jaw clenched. I couldn't have signed anything. I remember that day. I was terrified about the surgery. They gave me something for anxiety that made everything fuzzy. I remember the nurses. I remember you holding my hand. I don't remember any attorney. He closed the folder and looked toward the door. I need to talk to your sister. Alone. Dad, you should rest. Now, Sarah. Please. I waited outside Dad's hospital room while they talked. I could hear raised voices through the closed door, though I couldn't make out specific words. Dad's voice, stronger than I'd heard it in months, cutting through Alara's attempts to interrupt. Her voice rising to match his, then breaking into sobs. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the gray linoleum floor. Other patients' family members walked past, some glancing curiously at the closed door. A nurse approached looking concerned, but I shook my head. Family discussion. They're okay. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, each minute feeling like an hour. When the door finally opened, Alara stormed past me without looking back. Her face was blotchy, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't stop. Didn't say a word. Just kept walking until she disappeared around the corner toward the elevators. I waited a few more minutes before going back into the room. Dad was sitting up in bed, his face exhausted but resolute. I need you to do something for me, he said. What? I want an independent evaluation. A doctor who doesn't know either of you, who can assess whether I was capable of making that decision last week. Dad's request for an independent evaluation moved faster than I expected. The hospital cooperated immediately, likely concerned about liability issues if capacity had been compromised during the document signing. A psychiatrist who specialized in geriatric competency assessments came in 2 days later. He spent over an hour with Dad, conducting cognitive tests and reviewing medical records from the day in question. His report was clear and damning. Based on sedation records, medication levels, and documented confusion, Dad would not have met the legal threshold for capacity to make major financial decisions during the time frame when the will was allegedly signed. He recommended an immediate suspension of the revised estate documents pending full legal review. Dad also formally requested that all financial accounts be frozen temporarily. No distributions could be made under either version of the will until the capacity question was resolved. The hospital's legal department notified Aaron Finley of these developments by certified letter. I waited for his response, expecting more aggressive pushback. Instead, his office became completely unreachable. Phone calls went to voicemail. Emails bounced back with auto-responses about limited availability. His secretary claimed he was out of the office indefinitely, handling a family emergency. The disappearing act told me everything I needed to know. What followed wasn't dramatic. No courtroom confrontations. No explosive revelations in front of gathered family members. Just a quiet, thorough investigation by the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Someone from the hospital had filed a complaint about the circumstances of the will signing. Whether it was the sympathetic administrator who'd helped me with the sedation timeline or one of the nurses who'd noticed inconsistencies, I never found out. But once the investigation started, other complaints emerged. Erin Finley had a pattern. Other families came forward with similar stories. Elderly relatives signing documents during medical crises. Rushed timelines that didn't allow for proper capacity verification. Witnesses who seemed connected to the beneficiaries rather than being truly independent. The committee subpoenaed hospital records, phone logs, witness statements. They interviewed Patricia Holbrook and James Chan separately. Their stories didn't match. James admitted he'd never actually met Dad before the signing. Patricia claimed she had, but couldn't answer basic questions about his condition. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, Alara stopped visiting the hospital entirely. She stopped calling. The family members who'd lectured me about causing stress suddenly went silent. Nobody apologized, but nobody defended her anymore either. The final ruling came through on a Tuesday morning. The revised will was declared legally invalid due to compromised capacity at the time of signing, conflicted witnesses, and failure to follow proper verification protocols. Erin Finley faced a formal disciplinary hearing that would likely result in suspension or disbarment. The original estate plan was reinstated immediately. Dad would have the opportunity to make any changes he wanted once he'd fully recovered, with proper legal counsel and clear medical verification of his decision-making ability. But the ruling did more than just void the paperwork. It established a record, an official finding that my sister had manipulated a vulnerable parent during a medical crisis for financial gain. That record couldn't be erased or rewritten. It was permanent. I found out later that the Bar Association had referred the case to local authorities for potential investigation into elder abuse. Whether charges would be filed remained unclear. But the possibility hung in the air, changing everything. Alara had lost more than money. She'd lost credibility. She'd lost trust. She'd lost the family narrative she'd carefully constructed over months of performances. Control was all she'd ever wanted. And now it was gone completely. The consequences rolled out quietly over the following months, each one small but permanent. Erin Finley's suspension was finalized. He couldn't practice law in our state for 3 years, and the disciplinary action appeared in public records that anyone could search. His website disappeared. His office closed. Patricia Holbrook and James Chun faced no legal consequences, but their names appeared in the Bar Association's findings. Future attorneys would think twice before using them as witnesses. Alara's access to Dad's finances was revoked entirely. She'd been listed as a backup power of attorney in the original documents, but Dad formally removed her from all legal and financial roles. She wasn't cut out of his life completely, but the trust was gone. The family dynamics shifted without anyone directly addressing what had happened. Relatives who'd criticized me stopped calling both of us. Holiday gatherings became awkward, sparse affairs. My aunt, who'd lectured me about causing stress, never mentioned it again but also never apologized. The silence was its own kind of acknowledgement. I didn't gloat. I didn't send triumphant messages or post vindication on social media. I just continued visiting Dad, helping him rebuild his strength, making sure he had what he needed. The difference was that now I was doing it by choice, not obligation. Dad recovered slowly but steadily. 3 months after surgery, he was back home with in-home care support during the day. I still helped, but I'd set boundaries this time. Scheduled visits. Specific responsibilities. Time for my own life. One afternoon, he asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. His hands were steadier now, his mind sharp again. "I need to apologize," he said. I started to interrupt, but he held up his hand. "No, let me say this. I was weak. Not just physically. I let Alara manipulate the situation because it was easier than confronting her. I knew she was playing the victim. I knew you were doing all the real work. But I didn't want to deal with her emotions, so I stayed quiet." He paused, his voice thick. "That silence nearly cost you everything. It nearly let her steal your inheritance and your dignity. I'm sorry." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I don't need apologies, Dad. I needed the truth. And you gave me that when it mattered." He nodded slowly. "What do you need now?" I thought about it carefully. "I need to step back. Not abandon you, but stop being the only person responsible for everything. I need to reclaim my life. I started rebuilding piece by piece. I'd put my career on hold for months to care for Dad, but my employer had been understanding. Now I requested full-time hours again. Projects I'd missed. Opportunities I'd declined. I threw myself back into work with renewed energy, remembering why I'd loved my job in the first place. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the caregiving months. Dinners and coffee dates and actual conversations that weren't about medical appointments or insurance claims. I remembered what it felt like to talk about books, movies, weekend plans, normal life things. I moved to a new apartment closer to work. Something fresh with better light and space that felt like mine. Not a temporary crash pad between hospital visits, but an actual home. I didn't make announcements about my new life. No dramatic social media posts about cutting toxic people out or starting fresh chapters. I just quietly built the life I wanted, one decision at a time. Some family members noticed my absence from various gatherings and reached out with careful questions. I kept my responses brief and pleasant. I was fine. I was busy. I was focusing on myself for a while. Nobody pushed back. The truth was documented, permanent, impossible to dispute. I kept my dignity throughout everything. That mattered more than any confrontation or vindication speech ever could. Years passed. Dad lived independently for another 4 years before his health declined again. This time we had professional caregivers and a clear plan. Alara remained distant, showing up occasionally but never regaining the access or trust she'd lost. The family learned to function around the gaps her absence created. I built a career I was proud of. I maintained relationships on my terms. I learned to recognize manipulation early and set boundaries without guilt. The experience had taught me things I'd never wanted to learn but desperately needed to know. Sometimes I heard through relatives that Alara still told people her version of events. In her story, she was the victim of a vindictive sister who'd turned everyone against her. She'd only been trying to help Dad make difficult decisions. I twisted everything out of jealousy and control. It didn't matter. The documented truth existed in court records, hospital files, and bar association findings. Anyone who wanted the real story could find it. I never felt the need to defend myself or correct her narrative anymore. The people who mattered knew the truth. The others weren't worth my energy. The real inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the dignity I'd maintained, the truth I'd uncovered, and the life I'd reclaimed. That was worth more than anything Alara had tried to steal.